Hello, everyone, and welcome to the STEM Leadership Alliance broadcast today with our very special guest, Dr. Stephen Pruitt. I want to welcome everyone, and I hope that you are staying safe and all is well. Today's webinar is going to talk about demystifying the next generation science standard, and there's truly no better expert than to have Dr. Stephen Pruitt in the room with us today, virtually. I first would like to turn this over to Buddy Harris, who is the Director of Strategic Partnerships for UB Tech Education. And UB Tech Education has been a long-term partner with the STEM Leadership Alliance, so we're honored to have them also part of this. Buddy is going to just give a very, very brief few-minute overview of what UB Tech is focused on in terms of virtual education. They're one of the leaders in artificial intelligence as well. And Buddy comes to us from the Office of Innovation at the Ohio Department of Education, where he oversaw competency-based education, the Innovation Lab Network, and Ohio STEM School designation progress. As well as many, many other initiatives there. And today he's focusing on connecting innovators in education with partnerships to really look at robotics. And they're doing some great work in this virtual age here. So with that, Buddy, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Kelly. It's a pleasure to be here and join the STEM Alliance and the leaders on the call today. And you know, it's really a remarkable time, but I was thinking that, you know, maybe there's really no better time like now to, as we're here in the middle of a global pandemic, to discuss NGSS and robotics. You know, I really appreciate the chance to share a little bit about UB Tech Education and our integrated STEM approach, and especially share the time with Dr. Pruitt. The first time I saw Stephen speak, it was at the Council of Chief School Officers meeting with a bunch of other state folks from across the country. We were there and assembled to discuss performance assessments and the ways to encourage states to utilize authentic demonstrations of learning as part of accountability systems. And so I'm sure that discussion is something that's near and dear to the hearts of many people on the call. So it's my understanding that many of you on the call are either in your first year of implementation of NGSS or planning to fully implement in the fall. And for as many challenges as the current crisis has created, I would just like to put out there that I think that there's a huge opportunity to capture the urgency in this moment for integrated STEM and the rigor, the problem solving, the cross-cutting concepts, and the work readiness skills that NGSS instills in kids. And so what better evidence do we have for the need for those than the experience that we're having right now? We're having a similar conversation at UB Tech Education. If anything, this crisis has illuminated the vulnerabilities and demonstrated the value, the potential, and quite frankly, the inevitability of automation. So you may have seen how robots are being used to sanitize hospitals or stock shelves at big box stores. In China, our cruiser robots were actually being used to test folks for the virus. And so it's not a question of will increased automation happen. It's really a question of when that's going to happen and whether our students are going to be prepared for that. So at UB Tech, we produce modular robotics kits for elementary level students all the way up through high school with our advanced kits that are aligned to computer science, engineering, and advanced robotics curricula. And I think we have a truly unique, as Kelly mentioned, artificial intelligence curriculum that's being released in the summer to work with our advanced kits. You know, so we're thrilled to support the STEM Alliance and ultimately, because ultimately our approach is very similar to, I think, many of you on this call. UB Tech partnered with NGSS experts to design our UKIT curriculum to capture the methodologies and instructional practices used in the standards. And we have comprehensive units for grades 3 through 8 that utilize project-based learning to connect robotics with core content from science, math, and the humanities. And so as much as our kits utilize NGSS methodology, I think what really ties us to the work that you guys are doing is really more specific to the spirit of NGSS. The idea that real-world problems will not be siloed into single subject areas or disciplines. and you need your robotics program to reflect those cross-cutting principles. So as we think about our pandemic and our current situation, it's not hard to see how sometimes the science is only as good as how well it's contextualized and communicated. And that's an NGSS way of thinking. And with a nod to Dr. Pruitt, I don't think there's any real better argument for performance assessments than how our society is dealing with this pandemic. And so I'll make two quick plugs and then I'll turn it back over to Kelly. So we have assembled free resources for educators and parents on our home learning resources page. That does have webinars in artificial intelligence for educators, as well as design challenges for students and parents. And then secondly, we're working to create virtual camps for the summer that some of you might be interested in. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Kelly and just say thanks again for your partnership. And we look forward to continued conversations and hope we have the chance to work with many of the districts in the future. So thanks very much, Kelly.
Well, thank you, Buddy, and thank you, UB Tech, for your work and your contributions. And there are a lot of great resources that are on your webpage, and it's not even about the technology. It's even, thinking critically and problem solving. So thank you for that. So now, with no further ado, I would like to turn it over to Dr. Stephen Pruitt, who currently is the president of the Southern Regional Education Board. Prior to that, he was the Commissioner of Education for the state of Kentucky. He worked very closely at the national level with agencies and educators around the country to improve policy and practice in science education. He also, while in Georgia, served as the Science and Math Program Manager and Director of Academic Standards, and was the Associate State Superintendent for Assessment and Accountability, and Chief of Staff for the Georgia Department of Education. I want to give a little bit of background on that. Because I think the most important part too, and why we're all here today, is really for this conversation around the next generation of science standards. And Stephen has this wealth of knowledge and information that we're just honored and proud to share with you. And I'm going to now turn it over to Stephen, who's actually coming to us live from outer space. So with that, Stephen, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Kelly. Yeah, I decided to go outer space. So I told Kelly this earlier. Normally, the way things work in our house right now while we're all in shelter in place is I have two teachers teaching online, and I have a daughter who is taking college courses online, so I get relegated to the patio. Well, as luck would have it, somebody decided to go cut their grass, so they allowed me in the house. But I figured it's science. We need to talk about space anyway. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen so that I can actually put together a little slideshow here for us to it kind of helps me keep focus too on the things I'm saying. So I received a set of questions that Kelly kindly collected. I'm going to try to get to most of those in the presentation. But some of them I think were naturally there. Others I'm going to try to weave in a little bit more. So first of all, demystifying three-dimensional science instruction, and this is about NGSS, but it's also about 3D science. There's a lot of states that for one reason or another haven't adopted NGSS, or they're developing their own. But one thing is clear: they're all focused on at least attempting to get three-dimensional science instruction. So why does that matter? Well, we've spent a lot of time talking about STEM and talking about, frankly, if you talk to 12 people about what is STEM education, sometimes you'll get 13 answers. And the reason why it was time to really go forward with new science standards and new science approaches, to me, it really breaks down to the fact that we're in the fourth industrial revolution. Back in 1784, we had the first power loom, and so we had mechanical production with steam and water. The second one came 90 years later in mass production using electricity. Then, of course, in 1969, which is an after effect of Sputnik and all of the space programs, we end up with the digital age. Well, now we're in a cyber physical systems age. And I'm going to give you some examples of why I think that's a big deal, and some evidence, I think, of why we are there now. But if we continue to teach science the way we always taught it, all it does is it continues to put us farther and farther behind. It's simply not a way that you can just memorize. It's got to be a way you think. It's got to be a way that you apply things to your life. And at the end of the day, it's about really being able to look at the world around you and come up with explanations to the phenomena that you literally live in every day. So just a little bit of history in case because one of the questions I got was, about development. So back in 2011, we had a lot of things going on. The Great Recession had just ended, but it was not forgotten by any stretch. The Average Student Succeed Act had been signed. Unemployment was high, but stabilizing, maybe. And there was a need to create jobs. Now, Buddy did a great job because he actually kind of teed me up here pretty well. That kind of looks a little familiar, doesn't it? It's sort of like what we're dealing with right now with COVID-19. So we'll get to that in just a second. So where we are, three-dimensional standards are becoming the norm. In states across the country, whether they have adopted NGSS in part or in whole, or whether they develop their own, what we see more and more are 3 dimensions to the standards. And I'll talk about those 3 dimensions in a moment in case you haven't actually seen those. State assessments, they continue to evolve. They are still a requirement. They always will be, because they are one of the ways to ensure that there have been equitable opportunity to learn across. But states are struggling a little bit with the science assessment. I was actually pretty proud of where we were before I left Kentucky. But it's hard because no one's ever done it this way before. It's really easy to write a question that says, which of the following is anaphase? It's a whole other type of question to say, I'm going to figure out what I think is better, wind power or water power. And I actually have to give evidence for why that works. Curriculum continues to evolve. We have things like Open SciEd. We have other companies that are doing different types of curriculum. We have one example here with Buddy today. And I do think that there is some significant push to move the curriculum. Naturally, there's also some big resistance to moving that curriculum. But as more states move to 3-dimensional standards, I think we're going to see more of that. Policy continues to formulate what we do. I think this is also where, especially in the world that we're in today, we need to ensure that science, STEM, education does stay at the fore in policy so that it doesn't get lost. Reading and math are absolutely critical. But we also know that science is why we needed math. It's why we use reading. And it's often the thing that motivates a lot of our kids to actually get further into reading and math. And I'm going to end it with just COVID-19. This has been, I don't need to say this. Everybody knows that, everybody's heard the term unprecedented event. It is. We are, and I hope I can lay out for you a little bit about why this matters. But this, to me, has put a major change in how we will approach the world. Because we are looking at changes in the demands of the workforce. We're looking at the realities of a need for a scientifically literate society. Now more than ever, I think that we need that, whether it be because of workforce issues or just the issues that we live with on a daily basis. So SREB did a couple of reports a few months ago, that provided a perspective of what's going to happen in the South if we don't do anything to change how we approach education. In particular, the fact that we've got to start thinking about education as a full system, all the way through adult education. We have people who are in the workforce right now that are ages 25 to 35, who they simply don't have the skills to go to the next level when automation and artificial intelligence really takes off. And they will be unemployable. In fact, in the South, we're predicting that we're going to see as many as 18 million unemployable adults if there's not significant change. Now, the thing is, when in 2030, when these people were supposed to lose their jobs, that's also when their kids are graduating high school, which means we have to do upskilling for the people that are in the workforce, but we also have to change how we're providing training and education for their kids. Because kids are 10 times more likely to go into the same line of work as mom and dad. So that 18 million could actually increase if we don't do something differently. Now, here's the reality about what's happened with COVID-19. We actually outline this as 2030 kind of being that year on the horizon. We're driving down the interstate and we see in a distance, 2030 is coming, we should be doing something. But what COVID-19 has really done is it's actually made this the next exit. This is actually going to significantly change how we approach things. By 2030, we're going to have a more dependent population than we've ever had. For every 53 age-dependent people in the U.S., we'll only have 47 working-age adults. That means we can't afford for any of those 47 working-age adults to not be working. Otherwise, the strain that puts on our country, the strain that puts on our social systems is just going to be overpowering. The changes in the workforce is about automation and potential. So again, buddy, I'm really glad you're here. The work that you guys are doing around helping people see how artificial intelligence and automation can be taught in classrooms is critical. 23 to 44% of work activities may be automated by 2030. And actually, like I said, I don't think we're even talking about 2030 anymore. So this is what happened in the last recession. In the last recession, those who had a high school diploma or less, they lost 7.3 million jobs. And up until May of 2016, they had added 8 million jobs back. But that's a pretty low net loss or net gain. We had 400 million jobs. We added 400,000 jobs, even in the recession for those who had a bachelor's degree or higher. And people that had some college still saw an increase in the jobs available. So what that really works out to is, if you look at it just in terms of people, for those who were high school or less, only 80,000 people gained jobs after the recession ended. Well, why is that? The reason is because there was simply no jobs for them to go back to. Think about it this way. With what we're living in right now, 8 weeks ago, we had healthcare workers that were ordering mass amounts of face shields from manufacturing companies. About 6 weeks ago, people started realizing you can make those on 3D printers at universities. About 3 weeks ago, people started getting their own 3D printer and making their own. So yeah, we've heard a lot of people talk over time about how this big wave is coming, and some people dismiss it. But the reality is how fast this is happening is really changing how we look at the world. Because you see, after the recession, there was a net loss of 4.8 million people who did not have the ability to get those jobs back. So the thing is, we have a declining low-skill jobs. High school diploma or less will no longer cut it. Incomes below the poverty line in physical repetitive labor, those things are on the decline. There's a greater push toward middle skill jobs, more high school diplomas, but yet less than a bachelor's degree. Mid-level incomes, 35 to 75,000, and a projected job growth is 52% between 2014 and 2024. Don't know what that'll be now with COVID, but that was the last data we had. Now, at this point, some of you may be going, wait, I thought I came to hear about science standards. I thought I came to hear about what these standards were about. You did, but here's the thing. We actually had to go through that because why did these things need to be done in the first place? Because the world was changing so much and so rapidly, but we also know so much more about how kids learn science. So in the old days, this might have been a good engineering challenge. Engineer construct a platform that supports the mass of a full bottle, it should be of water, in a stable position as far above the table as you can, using only 2 sheets of paper and 1 full bottle. Now, here's what happened. And I was guilty of this when I was in the classroom. Well, gosh, all right, we're going to have a competition. Let's see who can do the most. So let's take a a measuring tape and see who does the most. And it was a competition. It was fun. Basically, everybody got a good grade on it. Asked the kids what they learned when it was over. Most of the time it was, yeah, I learned that I can do some things with paper and hold up a bottle of water, but not really have any discussion about the physics, about the engineering aspects of this. So the idea of moving away from just doing activities and just focusing on content is the idea that came from the National Academies of Science through the Framework for K-12 Science Education, which was the base document for the next generation science standards. So in that, it was really about having quality STEM. A quality STEM will require contextual application of the multiple dimensions by students. We were very clear about this being three-dimensional performance, meaning the students perform their knowledge. So, buddy talking about me doing formative assessments and doing performance assessments, this really comes to a head here because you can't necessarily do all this at the state level. I mean, you just, people try to make state level assessments do too much. But it's critical that they do it in the classroom and that the state does, is three-dimensional assessment, although the performance aspect might be changed quite a bit. There needs to be a focus on phenomena or problems versus topics. So, one question, for instance, I get a lot is, why is it that some of my favorite topics are no longer in the standards? I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment, but here's the deal. What we know from research is learning topics for topics' sake do not matter. I can quote you, I can work 1,000 Charles Boyle's gas laws, ideal gas laws, but if the kid doesn't really see why they need to learn it, why should they? So the idea is that phenomena is what is the engaging part. It's also what allows students to really tap into the deep knowledge that's contained in these standards. The focus is on how and why, but it's also focused a little on the what. So some people go too far to the other side. They say, okay, so we don't have to teach anything that kids, any base knowledge. Well, of course you do. But what matters is how do you use that base knowledge to describe how and why something works. So the three dimensions that I keep talking about, science and engineering practices, disciplinary core ideas, and cross-cutting concepts. The idea behind the framework, the NGSS, or any three-dimensional set of standards is that kids operate at the nexus of those three things. They can bring those three ideas together and perform or make their thinking visible about how they're constructing an explanation, how they're constructing an argument, or whatever. So what are these practices? Well, first there's asking questions and defining problems. Now there's science and engineering practices. Most of these are the same thing for scientists and engineers. But the reality is that there are some that are different. So usually scientists ask questions and engineers define problems. They both develop and use models. Now, that's a tough one because a lot of times we think models are actually representations. We get them mixed up. In fact, one of our favorite things to do in K-12 is make edible models. People love making the cookies and the Jell-O molds and representing atoms and cells. Those are really representations. In fact, some of you have heard me speak before, have heard me say this. If you can eat it, it's probably not a model. It's actually more of a representation. A model really is able to change. It's able to have greater explanatory power. Planning and carrying out investigations happens with both scientists and engineers, analyzing and interpreting data, using mathematics, information, computer technology, and computational thinking, constructing explanations and designing solutions. Again, a difference there between scientists and engineers. Scientists tend to construct an explanation about a scientific phenomena, whereas engineers design solutions for human constructed phenomena. Engaging in argument from evidence, and obtaining, evaluating, and communicating information. One thing I want to point out to you very quickly is about evidence. And you're going to see this throughout my presentation. Evidence really is not data. Evidence is data with reasoning. It's actually explaining why that data supports a claim that you're making. Now, our cross-cutting concepts. Unfortunately, this is probably one of the most difficult parts of NGSS, and it's unfortunately one of the most disregarded of it, I believe. My biggest fear is that someday I'll write a book that says The Forgotten Dimension. Part of it, I think, is because as science people, a lot of these come natural to us, but constructing instructional opportunities, assessments, and so forth, it's really easy to overlook these. And you have to be very deliberate about trying to pull this knowledge out of students. So the fact that students can look at patterns, they can do cause and effect, they understand what scale, proportion, and quantity is. To be honest with you, cross-cutting concepts right now, that's a pretty important thing with what we're dealing with regard to COVID. Systems and system models, understanding really how systems work. Energy and matter is part of everything. Structure and function, instability and change. Now, what about those disciplinary core ideas? Physical science, life sciences, earth sciences, engineering, technology, and applications of science. So those are the deep dive content. Now, here's the thing about the DCIs, we call them for short. They were designed to have broad explanatory power, which means that they can explain multiple phenomena. Actually, they can explain all phenomena, potentially, that at least that high school or K-12 kids are going to run into. I get asked a lot, gosh, chemistry just seems awfully thin. Where's all the chemistry? And so you need to know I have a PhD in chemistry education. I love chemistry. I mean, I love it. I love a good equilibrium problem, and I work stoichiometry problems for fun. I mean, I love it. So I'm certainly not going to have anything that is not going to have that in the document. But if you're looking for those topics, they're not going to be there. What's there is, why do those things work? Why does bonding work? If you ask people, what is bonding? They may give you a definition. Ionic bonding is a transfer of electrons from one atom to another. But why? Well, the reality is, in PS1, Structure and Properties of Matter, we talk about structure and properties of matter. Unfortunately, some people are only looking at one section of the document. Because see, really to explain bonding, you also have to look at PS2, which is about forces. You also have to look at PS3, which is also about energy. And to really explain the application of atomic theory, you also have to look at PS4, which is about waves. So can I explain everything I used to teach in my chemistry class using these standards? Absolutely. But the difference is, rather than me having a topic where I'm going to teach bonding today, or I'm going to teach stoichiometry today, I'm actually going to do it from the perspective of how can I explain the phenomena students are going to deal with. In fact, if you're interested, there's actually a video where I talk about how a whole chemistry class would work using a historic approach. So having kids actually experience what Lavoisier and all those guys did just in the groundbreaking days of chemistry. But the same can be said for life and earth sciences and engineering. If you're looking for one of your topics, don't look just in a section. You need to understand deeply why those things work. In earth sciences, where did all the elements come from? Well, they came from, the universe, from the Big Bang. So you actually, if you want to talk about that in chemistry, that's actually the Earth space standards. Now, some people could say, oh, you should have put them all together. But the thing is, standards are really an artificial construct of the world. You have to put them in places that make the most sense. And so we put them the best we could, and also with guidance from the national academies. So the engineering, technology, and applications, those really, there's some specific content with those, but those are all supportive of the three areas of natural sciences as well. Now, let's go back to that challenge. What might be different if we look at it from an NGSS perspective? Well, build a stable water tower to support a water ball. That's the challenge. Okay, so these are color-coded because in color coding, we always, when we're doing NGSS, we always had colors So it was easy to be able to tell that they were all three-dimensional. Also, it was easy to be skeptical if somebody colored something a color that we didn't think worked. So here we'll see, and if you ever wondered why there were orange, green, and blue, it's because I'm colorblind and those are the colors I could see. And so when we were developing with the writers, we had to pick those colors, and I always joke that if we did nothing else, we at least changed the color scheme of science education. So what would this be like if we really think about it in terms of a three-dimensional performance? Well, first of all, notice there's a lot more in this than there was in the previous. It wasn't just about building the tower. Here, students are going to engineer and construct a platform that supports the mass of a full bottle in a stable position as far above the table as you can. So let me point out, engineer and construct, that's a science and engineering practice. When you think about the stable position, that's actually a cross-cutting concept where you're holding those things stability, that's cross-cutting. So number two, develop a model, in this case a free body diagram, to show the forces acting on the bottle and to cause it to be stable on the tower. So again, the science and engineering practice is to develop a model. Forces acting on the water bottle is your disciplinary core idea. And here you actually have two cross-cutting concepts. Cause and effect is one of those, and then stability is the other. Now, rather than just doing it, measuring, going, yay, we all did it, and Kelly was the winner, we're actually going to say, now let's have a group discussion about this. So let's use conceptual mathematical models to communicate differences in net forces between systems that cause the phenomena. So now we're actually going to look at this from a systemic perspective. But we're going to have a group discussion about it because that's actually a really important thing for scientists to do. We're going to end it with an individual performance. They're going to revise the design of their tower and write an explanation for how the sum of the forces acting on the water bottle are more stable. So here's what happens. If a student actually builds something where the water bottle is exactly straight, then what they should be able to tell us is that the force of gravity is actually equal to the normal force. Those are exactly vertical forces. And so it's stable because there is no acting force one way or the other. They cancel one another out. Now, what happens a lot of times when people build these, though, is the water bottle actually tilts. Well, this is a little bit more challenging. This free body diagram actually shows us a little bit of difference. We know that for this to be stable, the normal force has to equal the gravitational force. But the problem is when it's tilted, you actually have these resultant forces that actually pull on them in different ways. So from the mathematical model of this, how could you explain a balanced force if this thing is tilted? And you would use this type of methodology. Now, I'm going to go into something here that is not been seen before. This is actually the first time that anybody will see these. SREB has been working on, if you're familiar with our work, we've done powerful literacy instructional practices and powerful math instructional practices. Well, I don't go anywhere that we don't do science and STEM too. So it's time for us to do the powerful science instructional practices. So now this is about instruction. This is not about how we actually do the work of the science and engineering practices. I don't want you to get those confused. This is actually, what do we look for when it comes to instruction? This is a pretty nice setup as to how we might consider this. Obviously things aren't always in sequence, but this is not a bad way to start thinking about it. So this powerful instructional practices here, first, making sense of natural and human design phenomena. Secondly, having students develop questions to plan and carry out investigations, design solutions, and or obtain information. The third practice, gathering data and information to use in developing evidence. The fourth one is reasoning how the evidence supports an explanation for the causes of phenomena. Then we want to engage in academic discourse. Then we were presenting evidence of learning, communicating reasoning through an individual three-dimensional performance, and then applying science learning beyond the classroom to make sense of natural and or human design phenomena. So doing those things, actually you can set up a really nice classroom for how to engage in NGSS or three-dimensional. One of the things I get asked a lot and always have since we started development of the standards is, what does this look like in my classroom? And I believe this is a pretty good example of how this works. So I actually in doing this, I worked with Brett Moulding, who was one of the NGSS writers. And in doing this, we kind of came up with this flow. And so what you'll see here, these are things that we have identified as behaviors and artifacts in using these practices. First of all, making sense of natural and human design phenomena. What would a teacher do with that? Well, there's a star there because I want you to know that every time I say phenomena going forward, it could be natural or human designed, either one. So in other words, it could be science or engineering. So what are some teacher behaviors? Well, they're going to select present relevant phenomena that motivate students to make sense of the causes of phenomena. In other words, the teacher's going to use phenomena that kids are going to care about. Let's see, when we go back to school at some point, what might be a phenomena we could use in biology? Well, I think we're living it right now. But there's all sorts of things, but phenomena that kids are going to care about. Now, some of it can be, cool, tricky phenomena, but, you want it to be something kids are going to care about. Having a kid drop a ball off the top of the bleachers and calculate the elastic collision and the energy change, they'll appreciate getting out of the classroom and going to the gym, but I don't know that that's a phenomenon that would really motivate students. So what are some behaviors of the students? Well, they carefully observe phenomena and develop preliminary explanations and solutions. So I'll give you an example here. My son just started teaching, and he actually did a pretty cool thing. He doesn't know I'm going to talk about him here, but he really bought into this. And he's a reptile guy. He's actually loves zoology. He has, several reptiles. But what he did for DNA this year is he brought in an Arizona mountain king snake, which has red, white, and black bands. Can be confused for a coral snake, except it doesn't have the yellow. And a California king snake. Well, both of them are king snakes. So what he did was he said, okay, here are two snakes that are both king snakes. Why are they the same and why are they different? And what he did was he had his students sit down and observe the phenomena of these two snakes. He walked around the room, let them touch them, pet them, whatever. And he had them write a claim for, in other words, an explanation based on what they thought at the time. So then he had them write, what's your evidence for why you feel this way and what's your reasoning for that evidence? The artifact then came along in that was an oral or written preliminary explanation solution. What he did was every 2, 3, 4 days after he taught new material or they experienced different labs or whatever, he would have them come back to that phenomena and revise the claim, revise the evidence, revise the reasoning. So at the end, he was very proud of telling me that every kid could tell him why those snakes were the same and why they were different. And he didn't teach that phenomenon. He used that phenomenon to engage them first. All right, the second big practice about developing questions to carry out investigations. What teacher behavior is using instruction strategies to engage students in developing useful questions. Not where the teacher develops the questions, but actually where the student develops useful, testable questions to engage in the investigation of phenomena. The behavior is that the students actually develop the questions to use in researching information from reliable sources. Students collaborate to ask and refine and improve their own questions. Now this is hard because especially right now, even though the NGSS has been out for a while, we still haven't had kids really been ingrained in how to develop good questions. So it's really going to be important that we get to this and stick to it. Again, the artifact are the questions most useful to generate empirical evidence? So they're going to write them, they're going to talk about them, whatever, but do they really generate empirical evidence? So what about gathering data? Well, teachers should develop and select a coherent series of three-dimensional student performances to direct the gathering of relevant information. The student should be able to work collaboratively to gather data and information through scientific investigation or engineering design. They can organize that data any way they want to, but it's about actually collecting that information. The artifact, data tables, charts, models, logs, whatever. How about reasoning for evidence? Well, the teacher behavior here is that they develop a series of coherent, I want to make sure that's clear, that's coherent performances. In other words, they can't be what we've done historically in science education. And I'm the first one to say I did it too. You do a series of labs, they don't connect to one another at all, and in instruction, we don't connect them back to why we even care. So a coherent series of three-dimensional performances that engage students in analyzing that data and using their reasoning to find patterns in the data. They engage students in reasoning, evidence-based explanations. The student, now the thing is, the student won't do that if the teacher doesn't create that opportunity. The student then needs to be able to analyze data and information, to use evidence, and to reason explanations supported by that evidence for the causes of phenomena. And then again, we have explanations, arguments, and graphs for the artifacts. So what I laid out about what my son did, he didn't realize it, but he was actually engaging in these in these practices already. So academic discourse, that's actually really important, that we have a discussion back and forth. And this actually connects very nicely to literacy. And the previous one was actually both literacy and math. They establish the teacher will establish norms in the classroom and engage students in class and small group discourse. You've got to create an area of safety where people don't feel attacked, but yet where they feel open enough to challenge. The student, they need to be able to communicate the reasoning that supports the explanation. They need to be able to be strong in why I believe this is to be true. What's my reasoning for that? The artifact can be a presentation, of formal or informal arguments. Written and oral always work. Presenting evidence of learning. The teacher behaviors throughout the series of student performances use formal and informal assessments to monitor student learning. These could be 1D, 2D, or 3D, but the teacher needs to be designing intentional assessments. You know, performance assessment, formative assessment are critical. When we come back from COVID-19, I'm telling you right now, we have to rely on this way more than we ever have. In fact, we might even need to shift the name of it from formative to diagnostic, because we're going to have kids that unfortunately, because of the COVID slide, because of missing a quarter's worth of school in some cases, that they actually have a reason to, or that we have a way to diagnose where they are and then help accelerate that learning. Student behaviors present evidence of learning to self and others. They're able to reflect on feedback from others. Again, the artifacts are pretty much in line. Communicating reasoning through an individual three-dimensional performance. You know, I call this making your thinking visible. So the teacher has to create, using instructional strategies, opportunities for these students to communicate their reasoning. And it can't be just, I showed my work in math. There needs to be an explanation of why that math works. The student behaviors communicate the scientific reasoning. They need to connect the performance, the investigation that they just did, back to why this matters in the bigger scheme, back to the phenomena, and ultimately to scientific theory. And then finally, applying science learning beyond the classroom. It doesn't really matter if a kid can only do the phenomena that's in the classroom. If you have done the job as a teacher to really motivate students to investigate the phenomena beyond the classroom, which means that really the initial phenomena was pretty interesting to them to start with. I think choice is always really important if you can do it. But the idea with this one is give kids an opportunity to go beyond just what you've simply done in that phenomena or in that unit, and let them pursue other questions. Give them an opportunity, if nothing else, to at least ask questions about those. Student behavior is that they're able to apply beyond the classroom. You know, everybody gets worried about the state test. Here's what all the research says. If kids engage in three-dimensional work. Now, at the time, they didn't call it three-dimensional, but they talked about the importance of practice, cross-cutting concepts, or unifying themes is what they used to be called. And just pretty core ideas. It's going to take care of the state test, mainly because they are able to take what they learned and apply it beyond what they simply did in the classroom and apply it to new and unique situations. So with that, hopefully people found that helpful and useful. Kelly, I'm happy to go to some of those questions you sent, or if we want to take questions, which way would you rather do that? Or do you want to just give me the hook and say, Stephen, we're done, it's time?
No, I think it would be great, Stephen, if you could take a look at some of those questions that were asked and some of the things that you had not covered yet, and answer some of those questions.
Sure. So I'm going to pull those up. Let's see. Actually, I should pull them up where people can see them, shouldn't I? No, maybe I shouldn't. So we've had different questions like, how do we engage students in new authentic learning equity outside the classroom? It's a great question. In fact, again, I think this is where we've got to be better about communicating to parents and families. We need to give they're not going to be able to come up with a lot of this stuff on their own. They actually do need the help. So to be able to engage them in new and authentic learning, equitable opportunities outside the classroom, that's actually a place where teachers can say, hey, so tomorrow night there's going to be a lunar eclipse. Here's the question I want you to think about. And it's great to bring it back into the classroom, but just let them get outside. Let them get a little dirty. Let them do some of their own experimenting, but you're going to have to give them a little bit of help off the front end. Question, have problems cropped up with states implementing 3D teaching and learning, regardless of whether they adopted or adapted? Any patterns or suggested solutions? Well, you know, the issue is that to this point, the framework and NGSS have not fallen prey to the concerns of them being across states. And I think that's in large part because these were owned by the states and by individuals themselves. On a recent NGSS chat, people said, what's your favorite NGSS memory? And mine was when we released these in Texas at the National Science Teachers Association. I asked people to stand up if they had been part of a writing committee, part of a review committee, part of a state team, part of a school team. And over 90% of the room was standing by the time I was finished. So these really are things that people care about, and they see why it can help kids. And so we've not really seen the problems crop up in terms of people accepting them. The problems have come with implementation. The problems have come where sometimes people try to do them too quickly. The problem, so from a pattern perspective, I'd say, you know, if you've ever been in a case where the principal walks in and says, okay, I need all your lesson plans by next week or next year, that's a problem. You know, these have got to be staggered. The solution to me is just dive in, work together. You've got some great resources at nextgenscience.org. Achieve, which unfortunately is actually closing, but their work is being moved to the National Academies of Science and to WestEd. And so there's actually some great resources there that you can look at. But you know, the issue always comes down to implementation. I've always said no great education idea ever died in the vision phase. It always is in the actual implementation. Got a question about a state that hasn't adopted NGSS. They're about to rewrite standards. It'd be a perfect time. Absolutely it would. Again, it depends on the politics of your state. And what we've said from the very beginning with this is owned by the states. So if states want to rewrite them, we have some states that have written their own version and have actually done a really nice job. But I think the NGSS, what was nice about them is that they gave a great example of how this could be done. Is there an assessment or checklist of attributes for NGSS funders that could be used to evaluate proposals? That's a great question. Here's what it's not an easy question, but it's a great question. I would encourage you to go look at things like the EQUIP rubric, things like the PEAK document, which actually was for instructional materials. There's also some great materials around assessment. And all those things really kind of lead back to the same message. Is it about phenomena? Is it about students engaging in three-dimensional learning and performance? How can districts continue to move the needle in implementing NGSS teaching strategies in the face of such major teaching and learning due to stay-at-home orders? Whew, that's a tough one. This is, I think, a great opportunity in terms of people being able to get deeper into the standards and how to think about them. There's a way that you could certainly provide through Zoom or through some other type of medium for people to have conversations about what kind of phenomena are we going to do next year when we start, and forcing them to have the conversation, maybe using the EQUIP checklist to say, are we explicitly bringing out all three dimensions? Are we explicitly having students use all three dimensions? But I think it's absolutely critical that we keep moving the needle. Now, I'm going to be real blunt with you on this, and maybe I shouldn't be, but I will tell you that I have witnessed some incredible K-8 instruction in NGSS. Just people doing some really, really great work. But I will tell you that high school continues to be the biggest challenge. And I think a lot of that's because people still want to teach the way they were taught in college. But the thing is, you look at places like Northwestern up in Illinois, you look at Michigan State, you look at some of the bigger universities, they're moving to this too. Because College Board moved to this with their AP work. I mean, this is where it's going. So if we don't give up our kind of sacred topics and start moving more toward NGSS spirited things, using the artificial intelligence and engineering aspects of things, let kids get deeper into it. I don't think we're ever going to get there. But this is a time to let people think about it and really focus on things. I just had a question come in, Kelly, and I know we're running short on time, but what's my overall opinion on NGSS storylines, specifically in biology, hoping to implement them next year? Now, I normally will not comment on curriculum because that's not my place. You need to evaluate them for yourself. But I actually think the storylines are pretty good. The person that wrote them was very influential in the standards themselves, was on the framework committee that was developed. I think storylines are great. I do think, though, that to effectively implement the storylines, you do need to have some type of instructional strategies. Something like maybe the powerful practices or something, but you're going to need a framework to put those in that really to matter. And then the last one I see on here is how can we align STEM to NGSS? It's done. Yeah, it's all that's left is designing instruction to do what you need to do. But really, when we did NGSS, it was so that STEM could have a greater prominence in our schools. Kelly, do you want to take it back?
I do. I had one final question. You have a couple minutes to answer that came up too, is about NGSS and real world problems and applications in the classroom. And that seemed to be a continued question that we received. So I'd love your comments on that.
So the real world stuff, that's the phenomena that I'm talking about. You know, really, now I would say this has also been a place that historically science educators, well, educators in general, have struggled with, because sometimes we come up with what we think are real world, but they're not really real world. So one thing I would suggest is find a good partner that may be in a business or in an actual scientific arena, and let them help you develop that. I mean, if I were in the classroom, in fact, my son and I have talked about this already because he teaches biology. Why wouldn't you use COVID as a real world problem when you start, or sometime during the school year? But things like sometimes as simple as roller coaster physics, solar heating, you know, how do you cook with solar heat? Somebody wants to build a big manufacturing plant on the shores of Crystal River where the manatees, it's a manatee preservation area. What effect would that have on the manatees? So those real world problems, they're there. The part that I think is the hardest is how do you get those to a level that students can understand them and that it's at an appropriate level for them? Because I mean, I wouldn't go talk about nuclear fusion to third graders, you know, but you can actually do some things that would be appropriate for them at that age. But you're going to have to really think your way through it. Because the other part is this, you also don't want to use a real world application that creates a misconception in a child that a later teacher has to then fix. So I make it sound like finding a real world problem or a phenomenon is easy. It probably is. It's actually the thinking of how to implement it that's the hard part.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Stephen, for that today. I want to encourage everyone to please continue to look at the STEMleadershipalliance.org website. We have a lot of resources. Some of those ones, Stephen, you had mentioned as well. We have resources from NASA and others too, and we're linking up with the other great organizations that are out there. If you're interested in continuing your learning in terms of NGS, going more in depth with this, I encourage you to look at the STEM Happens Network. They will be providing a series of professional development. It's on every Tuesday from 3 to 4 p.m. And those are professional development workshops that you can actually receive continuing education credits for. So we look forward to this. I hope everyone stays safe and healthy. And a heartfelt thank you to Stephen. I think this was highly informative. I love the new work that you're doing. And I can never get enough of hearing about the great work that you're doing as well. So thank you.
Thank you, Kelly. Thank you.
All right. And if we didn't get to your question, we'll be taking a look at those questions and seeing how we can supply some answers and post them onto the website as well. So thank you. All right, everyone, stay safe and healthy and just wish everyone the best. And hopefully it'll start warming up and things will start to go back to what we will call a new normal. Thank you with that and have a great day.
Thank you.